32, I think I will start. Welcome everybody to our panel of the Urban Working Group. Our panel is about prepare for the unexpected, urban governance in the context of compound crises and disruptions. And well, my name is Elisa. I'm here as a member of the Urban Working Group or co-convener of the Urban Working Group, together with Marielle and Matteo. And Marta is also part of it. She will maybe join us later. And we have some great panelists today with great presentations, 5, by the way. So I think we will just head right in. They have different topics about equity, resilience, adaptability, all of these topics that we are interested in for compound crises and disruptions and shocks that municipalities and cities have to deal with in our time and age. So I think we will just go right in to don't waste time, and I will give the floor to Geya with our first presentation. And it's about cities beyond crisis, the case of climate action in Southeast Asia.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm really excited to be a part of this panel. I'm just going to get set up with my screen. All right. So good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world right now. So my name is Geya Morales. I'm a PhD candidate in political science and international relations at the University of Southern California. And I'll be presenting a bit of my dissertation work on cities beyond crisis, the case of Southeast Asian cities. So as we all know in this room, national level authorities are lagging in their commitments to the implementation of various global goals. For example, the 2024 Sustainable Development Goal report states that only 17% of the SDG targets are on track, and progress in over 1/3 has stalled or even regressed. Meanwhile, while cities cannot be legal signatories to these agreements, local governments all over the world have found alternative means to participate in global governance, such as participation in various international fora. This phenomenon has been well documented and researched, has been well documented and researched across disciplines from sociology to environmental studies and geography. But the field of international relations, particularly the study of norm diffusion, has largely overlooked the city-level phenomenon. And so I ask, why? Why do cities localize, where localization is a process of translating global standards into local policies? And more importantly, what outcomes can we expect, especially in the context of compound crises, as in the theme of this panel? So to respond to this question, I focus on the case of the Sustainable Development Goals, as the 2030 Agenda incorporates cross-cutting dimensions of climate action and sustainability that align with other development agenda, such as the Paris Agreement and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And just to demonstrate again that localization is a global phenomenon, I wanted to briefly share preliminary findings from a novel dataset on voluntary local reviews for the SDGs. VLRs are not the only forms of SDG localization, as I will demonstrate later on, but they are the most studied so far. And it is beyond the scope of my project to discuss localization across all of these countries, but what I hope to demonstrate is that the implications of my work are global, even as I focus on the Southeast Asian region. So for my project, I developed subnational case studies on 3 Southeast Asian cities: Metro Manila, Philippines, Jakarta, Indonesia, and Bangkok, Thailand. So 3 of the most populous coastal cities in one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world. And these cities are diverse in terms of their political systems, economic development, and the bureaucratic nature of their respective governments. But to return to my question, I revisit localization as a form of norm diffusion and link the work of norm life cycle scholars and global city theorists to provide a disaggregated framework for studying localization across 3 levels: recognition, translation, implementation. So I define recognition as the awareness and support of the language and ideas embedded in international agreements by city bureaucrats. This can include expression of public support through speeches or memos. Next, translation is the adaptation and integration of the language and ideas embedded in international agreements into planning and reporting. So this can include the creation of reports, monitoring and evaluation mechanisms, and planning documents. Finally, implementation goes a step beyond, is the integration of international commitments into more concrete local policy development. So this can include the reform or creation of new budgetary allocations or entirely new institutions, such as departments, commissions, or agencies. So while I have ordered these by depth, where recognition can be more superficial and implementation is a deeper and more credible form of localization, I don't presume that these processes are linear or mutually exclusive. A city may go through cycles of recognition and translation before moving to implementation to build political support for localization over time, or may even skip to implementation where localization is merely an internal administrative process. So again, this is just to highlight the heterogeneity of localization and why it's important to disaggregate how we think about it. In the next phase of my argument, I argue that cities possess varying enabling conditions and incentives to localize. Well, first, I argue that cities localize when they possess the political and fiscal autonomy to create new, highly specialized institutions, when they belong to an ecosystem of international organizations and network organizations that can support policymaking and project implementation. So again, this builds on like a very extensive literature on global cities and global networks. Oops. And finally, they must have a desire to either build or maintain their global reputation vis-a-vis the international community to actually benefit and leverage these different connections. So to test and further refine my theoretical framework, I conducted a year of fieldwork across the 3 cities, including semi-structured interviews with representatives from local and national government, international organizations, and other non-state local actors. And I supplement my interviews with primary source documents, including government documents, as well as secondary sources, including policy reports. So when analyzing my sources, I'm interested in both explicit references to the SDGs as a cross-cutting framework for sustainable development and more implicit references to the SDGs based on targets. So I just outlined a few of the themes that I'm most interested in. Towards the final part of my presentation, I think being mindful of time, I will focus on just preliminary results for evidence of both translation and implementation from my case studies, again, as the basis for further theory building. As I said, one of the most salient and studied signals of SDG localization is a voluntary local review. Out of all 3 cities, only Jakarta has produced a VLR. However, I have found evidence that each city is localizing, albeit in less salient ways. For the examples I will show, I will begin with Jakarta, followed by Quezon City as a component city of Metro Manila, and then Bangkok. So first, all 3 local governments have developed novel institutions explicitly tied to the norms embedded in the SDGs. For example, Jakarta has a secretariat dedicated specifically to SDG policy mainstreaming. Quezon City, again, which is a component city of Metro Manila, created its first ever climate and environmental services department, which is rare for not just the city, but for the Philippine context more broadly. And then finally, Bangkok's governor created the first ever chief sustainability officer position, again, in the city's history. So how did these institutions come to be? These examples show how cities have the autonomy to create specialized institutions, but this is not the full story. So tying back to my theory, I do find support for my expectations that these forms of localization were enabled through global partnerships. So all 3 cities have leveraged their proximity to international organizations and respective networks in pursuit of learning opportunities and collaboration. So for Jakarta, this was largely in part through the support of the Asia Pacific Office of the United Cities and Local Government. And you can see that their proximity, it's literal. They have an office right in the city hall of Jakarta, or the Jakarta city government, the SDG Secretariat Office. In Quezon City, the climate department itself, as well as its efforts to produce an enhanced local climate action plan, were directly supported and encouraged by C40 cities. I think many in this room is familiar with their work. Very similar to the United Cities and local government, they are a city network organization focused primarily on urban climate action. And then finally, in Bangkok, the governor's openness to partner with various UN agencies and development agencies has enabled greater awareness and support for the SDGs.
Just a reminder, you have 2 minutes left.
Oh, okay, thank you. I'll wrap up quickly. So finally, as I mentioned previously, connections don't always lead to implementation. However, all three cities are actively finding ways to build their reputation on the global stage, and more importantly, have shown that they recognize SDG localization as a means to advance their reputation. So in Jakarta, the incumbent governor is actively seeking to build the city's reputation as a global city and has hosted other global city representatives to exchange best practices on SDG implementation. For Quezon City, the mayor has worked to improve the city's reputation through various networking and ranking systems, including awards hosted by various UN agencies such as UNEP, the Environment Program. And then finally, for Bangkok, the governor has continuously campaigned with a tagline to make Bangkok one of the most livable cities in the world, and recognizes that the SDGs are key to advancing that goal. So ultimately, what I found is that while capacity is key in localization and network memberships facilitate learning and socialization and various sustainability norms, it is local leadership's political will, driven by a desire to build reputation and partnerships that sustain localization efforts and turn ambition into reality. So this is just a section of my broader dissertation work, which will look more specifically at the progress and tensions that arise at the project implementation phase, particularly in the case of flooding and renewable energy in Jakarta, urban heat and sustainable transport in Metro Manila, and green spaces and waste management in Bangkok. But again, to conclude, I argue that understanding why cities localize is critical to our knowledge of the enabling structures and incentivizing factors that can facilitate the spread of sustainability norms across regions and regardless of regime type or political system, especially in times of crisis. And with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And also perfect in time. And I just forgot to mention, we will have all the presentations and then in the end, a discussion of all of them, only if there are like very urgent questions, you should ask them now in the chat, but there's nothing. I think we can also go on to our next presentation, and that's from Niklas and Eric, I think, unraveling the power knowledge nexus in urban climate governance processes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Are you listening? Yes.
The floor is yours.
Yes. Perfect. Thank you so much, Elisa, for the organization and the invitation. And yeah, especially, yeah, thank you for the wonderful panel organization and the organization of this conference. Really grateful to be here and excited to listen to you as well, Gea. Like, I think our research really aligns. And I'm happy to be presenting as well part of my PhD project together with my colleague Sebastian, which is under the title Adding an Epistemic Unraveling the Power Knowledge Nexus in Urban Climate Governance Projects. This work developed out of my PhD, where I looked into the creation processes of urban climate action plans, and there I worked together closely with Sebastian, who used as well this data for his own thesis. And for us both, it's an additional project, so it is in the early stages, and we are very happy for your feedback. Yes, so the objective of our paper, which we are presenting here, is to develop and apply a framework for analyzing the power in urban policy creation processes. And yes, we have a very standard structure for this paper, but in comparison to other empirical studies, we really have as well a conceptual contribution to make. And yes, we will dive into this. So yes, we all know in this panel that cities are at the forefront when it comes to tackling the climate crisis. But for tackling this climate crisis, cities are developing climate action plans. They have been and they will do so even more, especially after the special report of the IPCC. It is to be assumed. And these urban climate action plans, these are impactful documents And for those reasons, we believe that it's really important to understand the creation process of this. And yes, the tendency in the literature and as well already in real life is that there is some tendency towards co-production, that these planning processes are more participatory, but yes, from our data and as well from the literature is sure that these participation processes can as well reproduce power asymmetries, and for these reasons it's important to understand the power within the creation processes. And there are several analytical frameworks for understanding power in these processes. One is very famous, which is the power cube of Gaventa. And the power cube of Gaventa basically says that there are 3 dimensions of power which can be analyzed, and the dimensions are interconnected, but still it's analytically useful maybe to separate them. So it's spaces of power where spaces can be closed or claimed, or participants can be invited, and then forms of power. So decision making can be visible, it can be hidden behind the closed doors, or it's the invisible power Gaventa is introducing. So shaping meaning basically, and then he's speaking as well about levels of power. And throughout our work, which was focused already on knowledge and power, we a little bit missed this knowledge dimension in this power cube. So we thought of adding a knowledge dimension. And this idea comes a little bit from the literature on linear and co-production, so that the belief that science is objective and neutral and needs to inform decision making, that this is a little bit abandoned, and that co-production is taking over, and it's seen as a more legitimate form of creating these analysis. And this is why we suggest to add an epistemic dimension to this power cube and want to apply it. This epistemic dimension says, okay, there's an authoritative way of adding knowledge to these creation processes, which is top down, and the knowledge is imposed by experts or from elites, with limited room for input or critique. Then there is a consultative way where knowledge is generated to consultation, and then there's the co-production form where really it's a joint collaboration on eye level basically. And yes, this is our conceptual contribution, which we then want to apply to our empirical case studies. For this, I traveled to these 4 locations, and we looked into the creation processes of the 4 climate action plans in Sao Paulo, Brazil, Ahmedabad, and Bonn. These these locations were given by the project, and then we conducted over 73 interviews and analyzed the documents, and looked into the data through MaxQDI and did some coding. And yes, right now Sebastian is gonna very quickly run through some key results.
Yes, thank you very much, Niklas. Now coming to the application of this framework to the urban climate governance processes. So in Sao Paulo, but also in Accra, we could very much see the cities following a standardized scheme by starting with greenhouse gas assessments and then localizing the Paris Agreement, which was then followed by the predictive policy program by the city networks called Pathways Tour. So we could see very much this tendency towards rationalizing these political decisions which very much foreclose alternative knowledges and also debates. And these measures, which were then pre-selected, could be ranked by local citizens in workshops against predefined criteria. So it was like rather consultative and an invited space with the scope of the participation already settled. And you can very much see the authoritative stance of science that is being referred to there. And yeah, there was also only one workshop, but this was unfortunately due to the corona crisis. And however, the local city administration was very much aware of possible power imbalances. So also during the workshop, they were trying to mitigate possible power imbalances, which also became visible in the rhetoric of different people speaking. So there was one person from a big industry which was a very good talker, and through moderation they tried to readdress these power imbalances. But also now here having a quite long quote, but it's very, very interesting, I think, because you can very much see that people of the city administration were aware of the notion of objective, positivistic, Western-dominated science, and therefore they kind of rejected this notion and tried to, kind of challenge it. And in between the chapters of the climate action plan, there were small pieces of art and poems, and yeah, maybe that would also be an interesting point for the discussion later, but maybe this can be seen as part of an epistemic disobedience. And yeah, now coming to the process or in Accra. So because Accra and Sao Paulo are both members of the C40 City Network, we had a similar or comparable process there. And as you can see with the quote, like the goal or the objective was to inform, educate, and collect feedback. So we are very much into the spaces of, or into the dimensions of invited and consultative spaces. But again, like following this greenhouse gas assessment and this predictive policing programs, which is also often referred to thinking algorithmically and yeah, very much foreclosed alternative ontologies.
Okay, sorry, Sebastian, your 10 minutes are up. Can you come to an end?
Okay, so maybe we're going to skip the other case studies and directly head into the discussion. So maybe I would pass on to you again, Niklas.
Yeah, thank you. So we have the different case studies, but we're just the discussion is basically that we hope that for addressing the polycrisis that we have seen in the past a failure of conventional approaches, and with this power cube we presented, we hope that we are able to address this polycrisis to a little bit challenge the linear view on science, this modern view on science, and create more participation and better participation. And yes, thank you so much for your attention, and we're very much looking forward to your feedback.
Thank you so much. Perfect. So if there are no further questions or very urgent questions, we will go now to who's next in line. Zane is next in line. And that's prepared for the unexpected in, oh God, no, I will butcher your name again, Doug. Okay, I think you have to say it. It's called Immersing Comprehensive Resilience.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes. And can you maybe
Right.
put this in, yeah, perfect. Now we see it also.
Now it should be in full screen, right?
Yes, perfect, thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'll start with a quick note that I slightly changed the title of my presentation and my manuscript along the way when I was preparing the manuscript. It's not a tectonic change, but since I was more and more immersing into the latest Earth system governance literature, I felt like, okay, I need to reflect that more into the title itself. So that's why you see maybe a slightly adjusted title. However, in broad strokes, the topic and everything else remains the same. It's just a bit of like, that conceptual presence and a bit of that conceptual twist to be integrated. Secondly, before I start going into the details of my research, I wanted to make sure that we all have a good awareness about which location am I talking about. So that's why I have taken from the Latvian Ministry of Defense website a nice schematic map of Latvia, which is generally situated in Northern Europe. So the water area that you can see in light gray to the left of Latvia's territory, which is in green, is the Baltic Sea. So I just wanted to draw your attention to this geography because my research is considerably tied to this geography. It zooms into these Earth system governance local dynamics and positionality of a specific place with a specific focus on the eastern region of Latvia called Latgale and its biggest city, Daugavpils, which also is the second biggest city of Latvia. And my whole preoccupation throughout the research is quite a lot tied to this border area that you see in dark green. So it's the border with Russia and border with Belarus. That is automatically also the EU external border and NATO external border as well. While my most focus when we talk about international organizations will revolve around EU, out of the sheer scope of EU competencies in various domains, including security, but not only that, I will also touch upon some of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO aspects, because those are prominent also in my empirical material. Okay, so yeah, and just to give you more about that geographic positionality before I go into details. So to the north, you see Estonia, and to the south, you see Lithuania. So Latvia is positioned in the center of this formation of three Baltic states. And to the south of Lithuania, there's Poland, another very important country for this overall analytical inquiry into the eastern border of EU and NATO. Yes, and to the north upwards, after Estonia northwards is Finland. And yeah, and then I will not go into more details about geography here. So, just to give you a quick outline of my analytical focus. I study how transformations, so that's my research question, how transformations in and around a city located in the EU, European Union, EU border region, keep the overall multi-level governance architecture of an EU member state and its offered agency options fit for purpose amidst the evolving geopolitical divides characterizing Europe. And this article is guided by the hypothesis revolving around maintenance, namely one specific type of agency architecture interplay. And it goes as follows: following the routine modalities of the EU decision-making process, the EU and national level governing agents have exerted a decisive role in maintaining the centrality and importance of EU border areas through the existing institutions by employing distinct techniques to reinforce a swift enactment of the existing rules, enabling faster procedures, solidifying norms, and physical embodiments of hard security guarantees.
I just want to remind you that you're at half of your time, just so that you know. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So briefly about the methods, I did a manual content analysis of two mostly important empirical materials and combined that with my ortho-ethnographic experience of Daugavpils International Conference this year. Here you can see the main outlines of both of these empirical materials, so they're web platforms. Both of these are established platforms. So my first encounter within my analyzed timeframe, starting from 2019 up till 2024 for the conference, and specific years of 2024 for SARCS or Guardian military news platform, are not novelty. So these are established platforms that have been operated already for years. So SARC started operating in 2021, its border security section, and the conference itself has been organized for more than 60 times. And what I wanted to share with you is also that SARC struck me with a lot of that visual performative material. So while there are some very useful factual details, what it gives most is that certainty that the action is taken, that the security concerns raised by the population and various other entities are addressed. You can see on the upper photo the visit of the Latvian president to the border area to check the border posts. There you can see also various services, border guards, military personnel, and also them in action in constructing these border fortifications. Then, although in the overall content, the Minister of Defense, Latvian Minister of Defense, is not portrayed only as present in the border, there's a lot about his international consultations with other allied countries, etc. However, I wanted to also put, that visual performance also here in front of you in a consolidated way, that he's positioned as being there in the field. He knows what is actually happening on the ground. On the upper photo, you can see him on the site in Poland during his official visit. On the lower part, he's together with the Latvian minister in Rezekne, so the second biggest urban settlement in Latgale, not restricting only to Daugavpils. Yeah? And then he's there on the other remaining photos next to the newly established border fortifications, so in a visually convincing manner. And then SARC also does a good job in terms of informing people in very detailed visual ways how border fortification is actually occurring and is planned to be advanced throughout the upcoming years in different countries. In the upper photo, you can see Estonian example, their focus. In the middle, you can see the Latvian fortification plan, and the lower part is East Shield. So that's the Polish one. So there's Baltic defense line that is among 3 Baltic states, and then there's East Shield that is an extension in Poland.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I won't go to. So then, yeah, just to quickly sum up, I have put also the most important things on the slide. This article addresses one contextual condition of the Earth System Governance Research Framework, transformations, and one research lens comprising architecture and agency, with an empirical focus on Daugavpils and Latgale as key national EU and allied border area. Through an inquiry into the agency exerted by the Latvian Ministry of Defense through its maintained military news portal SARCS, or Guardian, and the annual academic gathering hosted by Daugavpils University, this article demonstrates how transformation in and around a city located in an EU border region keeps the overall multi-level governance architecture of an EU member state and its offered agency options fit for purpose amidst the evolving geopolitical divides characterizing Europe, and these divides are most prominent in the hard security domain, where major hard infrastructure development represents the most materially imposing example. And then concerning the conference itself, that I didn't touch upon in such extensive way, the annual academic forum discusses these divides well before the outbreak of major military activities in Ukraine in 2022, with a reference to the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014. So there's a buildup of that concern. It doesn't start to immerse in 2022. There is a constant pattern of thoughtful concentration among university conference contributors and Latvian political and administrative and military leadership of the ongoing transformation of governance architecture, primarily, but not exclusively, linked to the national governance level, on how to strengthen the security and adjust the infrastructure to tackle the growing challenges posed by illegal border crossings and Russia's military assertiveness towards its neighboring countries. And that is echoed not just in Daugavpils University, which you can see in the photo, the upper photo, but also in the lower photo, the Mark Rothko Cultural and Art Museum, where also an exhibition, Bastion, like a fortress, was established in 2024 to echo the concerns revolving around the military actions in Ukraine.
Please come.
Yeah, sorry?
Please come to an end. Your time is up.
Yes.
Thank you.
And so finally, I wanted to share also one interesting nuance that came as a great surprise from my empirical findings, is that the current Minister of Defense has been also a contributor 2 times to the studied international conference in Daugavpils. So from a conceptual point of view, he takes a very interesting position in this research setup. First and foremost, he's part of the environment. So part of the academic environment as a professor at the Regression University, who is contributing to the conference regarding security studies and authoring some ideas revolving around post-Crimea setting and its geopolitical implications on Latvia and Ukraine. And afterwards, he takes this active agency stance of shaping even more in a more influential position, the governance decisions and the policy planning as the Latvian Minister of Defense. Yes, here in brief are some of my most recent publications. If you would like to familiarize with some of the things that I have not written on Earth system governance, but the complete set is so available on ORCID and Google Scholar. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay, again, I will see if there's some very urgent questions. And if not, we're continuing with Devin, with equity is not a necessary.
Hi, everyone. I have a 9-minute timer going, so I'll be good on making sure we wrap up. Very excited to present to you all an offshoot paper from my current ongoing dissertation project. This particular paper was inspired by a talk I attended back in March. Catherine McKenna, who has been Canada's kind of foremost climate expert, gave a really interesting talk, and one of the pieces of, or like one of the quotes she had during this talk was that when you do things good for the environment, it's almost always addressing equity. In response to a question regarding how municipalities or how states can balance goals related to climate mitigation along with environmental equity. So this sparked kind of an interesting analysis and research project from this, in which I conclude that when faced with tensions between equity and efficacy, equity is often discarded in favor of seeking effectiveness. And I use case study of cities to demonstrate this argument. Similar to Gaia, I use norm life cycles. So we know kind of the classic Fenimore and Sinkink model of emergence, cascade, and internalization. There's been a litany of work that's explored everything that's happened between these 2 stages here, but very little work that's looked at how we get entrepreneurs in the first place, and also what the effects of this type of norm life cycle is on local residents, especially when we are looking at the urban levels. So I apply a theoretical lens to the study of norms in the larger project here, just so you can kind of see where I'm coming from. In which case I use neo-Gramscian theory and post-colonial theory to add in a bit of the like historicness, as well as material analysis to understand how and why norms come to be what they are, as well as the effects of it. I have a few core arguments here. First is that colonization has played a role in shaping norms, and thus has also impacted equity on the back end. And that most importantly, best practices generally reproduce inequalities in global cities. So I'm looking at 4 different norms of interest here: climate action plans, transportation, pedestrian infrastructure, and green spaces. I promise, Gaia and I, while our projects are you'll notice there's a bit of overlap here. We did actually independently do all of these, but it's interesting that you'll see some kind of parallels and results we get here. So the research design, I have 4 case studies in total: Saigon, Seoul, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City. I'm just going to show you data from Saigon and Seoul for today, and happy to talk about Buenos Aires and Mexico City and show some more data and kind of bit of those case studies in the Q&A. Data I'm looking at, I looked at the city climate action plans for these 4 cities, as well as all climate action plans that have been released for the 96 cities in the C40 Climate Leadership Group. I've also looked at every version of the nationally determined contributions. In total, this accounts for like 4,000 pages or so. I don't use AI for any of my analysis. I actually have hand and analyzed all of these over the last several years. Third-party documents, including non-governmental organizations, press releases, newspaper articles, maps, and then ethnographic research conducted across 4 cities. For my analysis, I use a combination of Lian Fuji's patterning to understand repetitions of patterns, then also narrative analysis from Shel Shenov to understand what are the narratives that cities are trying to tell about their climate mitigation and adaptation approaches, especially as it relates to equity, right? And then also grounded visualization. And happy to talk a bit more about this methodology as well in Q&A. So let's turn to findings. Let's talk first about Saigon. So Saigon was one of the first cases that I chose out of my 4 cases. And a lot of this came from Vietnam being one of the only countries to talk about equity at all in its nationally determined contributions. It was one of the first countries to talk about it. It still is actually one of the very few countries to explicitly talk about equity in its NDCs. At the city level, we have also a mention of equity in its last full climate action plan in 2015. We've been in this kind of interesting cycle of waiting for a new climate action plan. It was supposed to be released in 2020. There was a pandemic. And then since 2020, there's been kind of a continuous state of the country didn't actually reopen until March 15th of 2022. So there's about 2.5 years of just full COVID response there. Not to mention kind of a sequence of administrative turnover due to a series of compounding crises. We see also, so what we've seen as a result is we have a master urban plan that's been released recently that touches on some aspects of the mitigation, but explicitly not adaptation. There's actually a section in there that if you look at where it says like climate adaptation, it's like, oh, this will be addressed in our like upcoming climate action plan, like TBD, right? But we do actually get some hints about what's happening with adaptation when we look at partnership documents from C40, USAID, and then also a new partnership with Monash University through the Climate Works Center. All of these things right now are kind of constituting loosely like Saigon's climate action plan, even though the last kind of full official document that we saw was 2015. So I'm going to show you quickly flooding 3 maps, and then we're going to look at what this looks like at the district level. So this is a map of districts across Saigon, the darker blue representing higher flood impacts, the lighter colors representing lower flood impacts. 2 things to kind of notice here. One, you'll notice that flooding impacts as a whole are quite high in the city, and this is because of like geographically Saigon being built on essentially a swamp and like rice paddy fields. This means that we're going to, in general, have lots of flooding. But the second aspect that's important here is that these are not evenly distributed flooding risks, right? And even within the districts themselves, titled Quans here, the flooding like risk levels vary even depending on what part of the district that you are in. Additionally, we don't see heat distribution happening evenly across the city. This is a map of the districts that I specifically looked at. darker red representing more number of days above 30 degrees Celsius, lighter colors such as in Quan 2 and Quan 7 representing lower days. And then green space is also not equally distributed. So Quan 2, which is a primarily expat western-facing district, having the most number or like the most amount of green space by kilometer squared, whereas Quan 3 and Quan 5, which are more residential areas, having the least amount of green space, right? And these things, to some degree, have some correlations with each other. So in terms of green spaces, District 5, which is also called Cholan, it's one of the ethnically Chinese areas of Saigon. You'll notice in the pictures in between here that we have functionally no green space. I actually have another picture that I haven't thrown in here that's one of my favorites, which is there's actually sections of District 5 that have these fake green like wrapped around the poles. So like some aesthetic greenness, but like literally they are plastic leaves. So very, very little green space. Yes, I have a minute and 30 left. Thank you so much. And you'll notice too, it's a high heat, very high heat region. We've got kind of minimal flooding impacts here, but we do have urban heat island effects taking a pretty strong hold. As opposed to District 1, the green spaces here are located, we have kind of plentiful green spaces. You'll actually notice in the map on the bottom right-hand corner, this is a residential area here, that this residential area does not actually include, like this residential area means that we're kind of in a situation here where the residents of the district, like there's not as many residents of the district, so we have actually kind of more green space, but way fewer residents. It has kind of a middling impact in terms of urban heat island effects. And a lot of this is because where the green space in District 1 is located, which is primarily around the government offices and then parks, but very little of the green space is actually located near like residential areas in here. Where the people actually do live in District 1, they are not actually benefiting from green space infrastructure. And we see a similar story happening in District 3 here. So I'm just going to go ahead and, well, I can show you Seoul at a, during Q&A if we want, but I'm just going to wrap up with, so equity in urban climate governance is negatively impacted by three things: economic structures and status seeking, lack of vulnerability considered in design uptake and diffusion of climate governance norms, and then few incentives or resources. And to address climate governance equity, I argue that we need to acknowledge that conditions vary, i.e., green spaces and the topography and geography of cities. This is not a one-size-fits-all solution. We need to prioritize and co-plan with members of vulnerable communities and then interrogate the outcomes of private-public partnerships and community-owned resources. Again, happy to talk about any and all of this more, website, email, if you all have feedback or questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Perfect. So thanks. We are going to our last presentation if there's no question left, because then we would go to Dan. And sorry, no, I forgot your. Yeah, city diplomacy as a driver of adaptability.
Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for letting me be part of the panel, and thank you for those that have accepted very poor time zone situations, which I often get here in Australia, so I appreciate people being flexible to be here. So I'm going to present, this is some pretty exploratory work, so bear with me. It's sort of starting with some kind of unique empirical data set that I've got, and using this panel theme as sort of a prompt. I've been thinking about some research that I've been doing on city diplomacy, so the international engagement of local governments, which I think we've already heard quite a bit about, and how this is being used as both a mechanism for cities to shape their responses to urban crises and multiple intersecting urban crises, and then also how those responses might in turn be sort of shaping city diplomacy activities and the broader sort of ecosystem of international city exchange that we see. So I think if we look at cities generally in the way that they're engaging internationally, there's often argumentation made, and it's very common in the literature, around the rationale for cities being effective actors, and sometimes more effective actors than nation states, which have been argued before in addressing certain urban crises. There's this pragmatism and adaptability and local responsiveness that they bring to the table. So this is often seen as a key advantage of cities, and also a key advantage by turn of the the broader sort of ecosystem of international city exchange that cities are operating in at the moment. So yeah, Akuda has written a lot on this, particularly around this idea of cities being diplomatic entrepreneurs and bringing perspectives and approaches to urban governance that in turn have allowed them to innovate in the way that they engage internationally, in the way that they deal with the existing multilateral system, and also shape and develop their own structures and forums which exist outside of the international system as well. So there's sort of two elements I'm interested in here in terms of the sort of overall theme of the panel. And I'm looking at a data set which is a global survey which has been conducted every 2 years since 2018. And I've been responsible for sort of the 22 and the 2024 edition of this survey. So an international survey of local governments and a whole range of factors of their international engagement. So it looks at things like the institutional structure that they have, the mechanisms, motivations, and impacts of their international engagement, also sort of the priority areas that they're looking at, things like how they're coordinating with national governments, how they're engaging with networks. It's got a range of different domains. So this is the sample for the 2024 survey. It's certainly not a sample without its limitations. I'm happy to talk about those in discussion in terms of geographic representativeness. But the idea behind the survey, it's had roughly in the last 3 iterations between sort of 40 and 60 cities take part. And the general idea is that it has a lot of depth in terms of understanding a lot of qualitative detail around how cities are engaging internationally. And I first sort of became interested, I'll just quickly, I won't spend too long talking about the method because I know we're sort of quite limited here, but in general, cities are being approached and the responses, the responders are generally sort of the person who's responsible for international engagement within the local governments or somebody who has those sorts of responsibilities. Cities who have previously participated in the survey are directly approached, as well as network partners just distribute this survey as well. And generally, data is collected and analysed using SPSS. We've done some analysis over the 4 cohorts, looking at comparison between those cohorts. And now that we've got sort of data of a number of cities who have been returning over those 4 different time points, we've also started doing some longitudinal analysis of those surveys. And while the sample size is not huge for that, I think it gives us a sense of the kind of different changing trends we've seen in cities' international engagement over time. So coming to urban crises, I think the reason why I first became interested in looking at how international engagement was shaping responses to urban crises, the 2020 version of this survey, the data collection for this was conducted just prior to the onset of the pandemic. So sort of early 2020 was when the data was collected. And the 2022 survey, the data was collected in 2021, right? Sort of in a peak period of the COVID-19 pandemic. And at this time, we were thinking that due to the general, restrictions on travel and other interruptions to international exchange that had happened at this time, that there would be a reduction in overall sort of city diplomacy and international engagement from local governments, and more of sort of an inward-looking, response to the crisis. And actually, what we found was the opposite. So even during this peak period of the COVID pandemic, more cities than the 2020 edition had actually said that they were funding a range of different international engagements. And the majority of these cities said that they actually engaged to shape their response to COVID-19. So they engaged internationally using their existing partnerships to shape their response to COVID-19, with 3/4 of these cities saying that they did so right at the start of the pandemic. And you can see on the right-hand side there an example of some of the activities that they said that were most impactful or most influential in shaping their pandemic response. And I think that it was sort of well publicized at the time. We've heard a few things about C40, the speed at which C40 and some other networks were able to mobilize their networks. So it's quite sort of famously, I guess, the mayor of Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti, brought together as a group of C40 cities to look at crisis response kind of in March 2020, mobilizing this network when a lot of the multilateral system was yet to sort of kick into gear around shaping collective responses to COVID. So it's this sort of adaptability and flexibility that's seen as a strength of this system, and I'll come back to that. So if we look at the issues that cities are identifying over time as being their priority issues for international engagement, we actually see quite a bit of stability in terms of the issues that they're identifying. So climate change has been by far and away the most selected over time. And I think that it's kind of demonstrates when you look over time, both the ability of cities to look at, address, and to have sustained focus on some of these slower onset crises, but also over time, the ability to adapt to more acute challenges and shocks. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So this is the priorities, international issues that cities are addressing from the 2024 survey. Migration is an example of an issue which has sort of steadily rose and become more prominent over each 4 iterations of these surveys. So only a handful of cities said that migration was one of their key issues for international engagement. In the most recent iteration, around a third of cities said so. In 2022, COVID-19 was a relatively high priority for cities in terms of their international engagement. That's obviously dropped down quite significantly. But I think in the case of migration, which I've done a significant amount of work on, there's been both a recognition of rising priority in terms of that as an area of engagement for cities, but also equally a change in the kind of networks in terms of existing networks, which are turning their attention to migration issues, but also, and there's been great work done on this from Thomas Lacroix and some other colleagues, on a real proliferation of additional networks that have come into play in really only the last 5 years, coinciding with this urban migration crisis. And I think we can sort of argue around the nature or the reality of that as a crisis itself. But certainly it's become a higher priority issue for cities, and also that's been reflected in that broader ecosystem of exchange. Interestingly, there's been quite a bit of work and focus from networks looking at disinformation currently. I'm involved in some work on that at the moment. And also we heard earlier from one of the panelists around urban conflict, and quite a few networks have been focusing both on conflict in Europe, in Ukraine, and also in the Middle East. But very few cities in this sample identified conflict as being a key priority engagement issue for them, and the same with technology, despite the focus on disinformation. So I think it's indicative.
You have 2 minutes left.
Great. I think it's indicative of both, changes over time, but also the relative stability of the focus of these cities. Last point I want to make before sort of concluding, there's a range of work, and I've done sort of some other work of this as well, as looking at the relationship between the city diplomacy and traditional foreign policy, or how cities are engaging with their national governments on these international issues. On the left-hand side here is just the same chart from the previous slide around the 2024 priority areas for cities. On the right-hand side are the issues that these cities say that they're engaging with their national government on, and in terms of the international dimensions of that, so not just on domestic policy. And there's relative alignment between these 2 areas. So there's actually the most alignment that we've seen. And cities have also reported increased communication with their national governments compared with previous iterations of this survey, which points to greater sort of national local policy coordination across a range of these different areas. And I think that that's important for shaping both the speed, the resourcing, and potentially the nature of responses to these kind of crises. So as I said, I haven't sort of come here with a fully formed study, and I'm very keen to have some discussion and sort of shape the direction that this needs to go in. But just a couple of sort of take-home points. I think that this survey research has sort of seen that this ecosystem of city diplomacy, and particularly city networking, has demonstrated some robustness, adaptability, and ability to change to acute shocks, and for existing networks to adapt and change their approaches and sort of thematic foci to address what acute issues of the day are. I think there's some questions around whether increased national local coordination has a potential to sort of limit some of that flexibility, dynamism, and pragmatism that has been sort of seen as a key strength of the way that cities respond to crises. And just finally, I think that there's some interesting work, and this is something I've sort of started to explore, around the way that cities respond, particularly in building multi-sectoral partnerships, and the skills that they have in adapting and delivering on sort of entrepreneurial forms of governance. And we can critique those, but certainly their skills and approaches that cities also bring to their diplomatic engagement, to their international relations, which I think sets them apart in some ways from other international actors, and can be a key strength to the way that they're shaping their responses to urban crises through this type of international engagement. But I'll leave it there.
Nice, thank you. Thank you all for these really great presentations. Great insights and also really great studies that we got presented today. I will open up the floor for discussion right now. And please, from the audience, please write your questions into the chat, and then I can read them. Or also, if you want, you can read them. But I mean, just wanted to say, I mean, I will see all the questions, I think. Hopefully, or we will all see the questions. But if there is so far no questions from the audience, we could also first start with ourselves if we have questions to each other. And I already see 2 hands raised. That's great. I will start with Devin, just because I saw you first. So what is your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering for the second paper, I believe it was Nicholas and Sebastian. I would love to hear a little bit. We didn't get to hear much about your coding process, but would love to just understand a bit more about how you all went about doing the coding and analysis there.
I think we would just, yeah, you can just answer right away because we have no particular order to, yeah, get the comments.
Yeah, thank you. To be honest, the coding is still underway, so we have not completely finalized it. Yes, we are looking into the patterns, focusing on the different case studies and using the MaxQDA for the coding there. We use the codes which emerge out of the theoretical framework of the power cube and have for the different 3 dimensions, so forms, spaces, and this added dimension of epistemic modality. We have yeah, created different categories which we then try to allocate basically. Yeah, but it's an deductive inductive approach a little bit, I must yeah, or which is happening.
Yeah, thank you. And you also had a question, right?
Yes, and I have a question for Devin actually. Because I really enjoyed the presentation and the topic, and I think it really, yeah, conceptually as well aligns quite a lot. And I would be interested in understanding a little bit more about the conceptualization of equity you use and what is underlying, because it's so central in your research, but there are so many conceptualizations out there, and I think, yeah, I would just be interested in you developing a little bit further. Thank you.
Yeah, no, great question. And one of the, I think, challenges in the climate governance space in general is deciding like equity for who, right? Equity for one group doesn't always necessarily constitute equity for other groups. And we're seeing this with tensions with like just transition right now, for instance, right? So in particular, the lens that I'm taking to equity is looking at equity for climate vulnerable populations, which those do shift a bit from like location to location. So in the case of Saigon, for example, climate vulnerable groups that I'm looking at equity for include folks who are elderly, lower socioeconomic income, youth, and then like ethnic minority groups, which in Saigon is slightly less than if I were to go out to some of the rural areas of Vietnam and look at equity in that lens. And then also gender. So those are the big kind of populations I'm looking at. In terms of equity, I'm looking for equity along 2 lines. First is like adaptation. So what does this do to kind of, I actually hate using the word resilience in this particular context because it's not really resilience, right? Like it's not like, oh, they're not resilient, you know, like there's just kind of this implication that like this is a fault of the individuals who are vulnerable to climate change. Instead, I do kind of like to look at like whether it basically increases or decreases their vulnerability at a structural level, you know, based on like incoming climate events. So anyway, all of this to say, What I'm looking at is essentially, does this policy make, from an adaptation standpoint, make them better or worse off with climate events? So it's not a very complicated frame for it, and there's definitely probably more I could do to kind of like suss this out. But I think it provides at least a good starting place for us to dive into, kind of these assumptions that are built into climate policy making, like Catherine McKenna's, which, is a very fair assumption here, right? That if we're just like, oh, if we're doing the work well, then it should be addressing this inherently. But unfortunately, like, what I'm finding is without a specific focus, and even in the case of Saigon, right, like even when there is a focus on vulnerable populations, it doesn't always play out in terms of implementation. So there has to be a really like strategic lens from design to implementation on vulnerable populations for us to get equity for those groups. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. And I think as well, there is a procedural element you might be interested in looking at. I think in the IPCC AR5, there's a whole, fleshed out version. I think you're muted, Elisa.
Sorry, I didn't get it. So sorry. Yeah, let's go to Zane next. Zane, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you so much. I actually want to ask this to whoever would like to respond. Thank you so much for all your elaborations on very different city contexts. And here I'm coming back to my quick note in my methods regarding my auto-ethnographic experience. And how do you clarify to yourself, in your research process, and maybe to some of the audiences that you address, your experiences or lack of those cities that you study? Why I'm asking this is because I think there is some kind of a strength of studying some cities that you are not so familiar with. For example, you haven't lived there because you look at it from a more systemic perspective, perhaps, and more looking at data and not so much immersive, referencing back to what you have actually experienced of certain services, certain places, etc. But at the same time, cities are, every city has its very specific fabric and contextualization and, that ecosystem, that even intellectual ecosystem of what it means to be here and to live here. And do you think that it's kind of important to control for that aspect within your research? And when you do research on cities that for example, you live in now, or you have had substantial experience, and those cities that you haven't lived in, but you're really curious about them, or you have paid short visits. For example, me, I studied Daugavpils. I haven't lived there extensively, but I am located geographically in the same country, Riga, capital city, and I have regular interactions on some occasions with this university. For example, at the moment, I'm working at Riseba University of Applied Sciences, and currently we are hosting Daugavpils University Rector's art exhibition in one of our venues. And that's how I come across with, their intellectual influences on a daily basis, right? So whoever, this is rather broad, but I think it's a very important factor of how we make meaning of cities. Thank you.
Maybe Dan, since you're also next in line to ask a question, maybe you want to answer this question, or is it okay? I mean, you come from a different research approach, so yeah.
Yeah, I'm very happy to defer to anybody else if they have a specific response to that one. I mean, I guess quick reflection, I've done some work which is looking a little bit more specifically, some sort of comparative case study research on cities that I had some familiarity with, but I've also done quite a bit of research which is more sort of similar to what I just presented, so that's more kind of comparative and quantitative in nature. And I think that is challenging to do in the context of having looking at a large data set of cities, making inferences based on those, and particularly when you're looking at very different governance contexts, not having full contextual information about the institutional setups of those cities, about these kinds of, social and political and cultural factors, it is really challenging. I think that's kind of the core. That's why there's a whole literature around comparative urbanism, I think. So, you know, I don't think I have a really kind of pithy or erudite response to your question specifically, but I would say that yeah, one actually interesting approach that I've seen in the past, a colleague of mine was doing some broad scale comparative quantitative research. It was some survey research, but rather than speaking directly to the local governments, they were actually asking experts, largely academics within all of those cities, to actually respond to the survey rather than, you know, going to the institutions themselves. And I'm sure other people have seen methodology similar to that, which I think is an interesting approach because I mean, in the case of, you know, asking an institution to respond to that, they have a particular motive to present themselves in a certain way and respond to the survey research in a certain manner. And at times you might, you know, it can be valuable to get that kind of in-person kind of, you know, contextual knowledge that comes from having an expert that might be slightly more impartial in that space. So yeah, I'm not sure that really answers the question, but it's a good one. Did anyone else want to respond to Zane's question? Or
maybe not right now, but
otherwise, I just had a question for Gaia, if that's okay.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, I just had a question, Gaia, around. I'm interested in sort of the process of voluntary local reviews and how cities relate or don't relate to their country's national reviews, and how, if any way, in your research, you've seen the sort of national approaches to engaging with the SDGs, and that's have any influence over the work that the cities have been doing to kind of localize these approaches, or, you know, to engage internationally and seek that kind of recognition element that you were speaking to as well.
That's a really great question. So I've been very deep in the VLR world, and I think I want to start by saying that there's no standard for VLRs. So they all look very, very different compared to, for example, voluntary national reviews, which will look a lot more similar across countries. I'd say the national level institutions play a really important role in whether VLRs happen. I think the US is one of the clearest, the most interesting examples where the US has not produced a VNR, but several cities within the US have produced VLRs. And it's actually an exception. And most VLRs, most cities that have produced VLRs are in countries that have already produced a national review. And so usually the support from, let's say, in the cities that I've studied and most familiar with, they're usually housed within the planning agencies within the national government, or the agencies that specifically deal with local governments. And so they are actually very involved in determining, you know, they say that they are involved, at least, right? They'll say that, oh, you know, we encourage local governments to produce voluntary local reviews to localize, you know, the SDGs because, you know, it's in line with our national commitment. But they don't enforce it, and there's still no standards even within countries. And that's why you have, you know, not all cities produce these VLRs, especially on top of all of the other plans that's required of cities, from like land use planning to, I think, in a lot of the places I study now, and this ties into a lot of the work that you all do as well. So there's a lot now nationally enforced kind of local climate action planning, where it's now an additional plan that cities have to report back to national government agencies. So long way of saying, national governments provide, or they say that they're requiring cities to, you know, produce VLRs, especially if a government has produced a VNR, but there's no actual enforcement mechanism for that, and there are no established standards for like what should be included in these VLRs.
Thank you so much. First of all, are there more questions between all of you? I actually find it very great that you're already discussing everything between each other. That's really good. And if not, also, I think there are no questions in the chat, right? At least I don't see anything. So if it's okay, I would also ask questions, or somebody else wants to go first, because don't want to put myself like just in line, but I think it's okay. Yeah, first of all, again, thank you for the great presentations. I really like all your studies, and I have some questions actually to several of you, so I will just go for it, okay? We'll first start with Niklas and Sebastian. Again, I really like your study. I mean, you also know that I did research on participation, so it's really great. I'm very much looking forward to your paper. And the only thing that I was wondering, like, I also really like the, what do you call knowledge? Like the material, sorry,
epistemic modality. But as well, maybe it's too complex to call it epistemic modality if it's not rememberable. I don't know.
Oh, I think it sounds pretty good. That's good. I was just asking myself, because we also confronted this problem quite often in our research. What is the difference between, is it knowledge, or is it like the opportunity to give input, or like power delegation, for example, or opinions? It could also be like, why is it defined as knowledge and not maybe other, like just the degree of how much can, yeah, persons or stakeholders participate actually? And just maybe wait, because I will just pose all of my questions, and then I give you the opportunity to answer to all of you. Then, because the next thing I also wanted to ask, no, I think this I don't have to ask, because this was also for Devin. I just want to reiterate what Niklas just told you already, so I don't have to ask it again. But like for equity, there are also in many conceptualizations, there are like procedural categories. So maybe you want to have a look at them, and also like the way how also people can maybe even decide on like measures that they are affected on. So maybe just keep this in mind. And for Zane, I also had a question, but this one is it's a unstructured question from my point of view, because sorry, I just noticed that with the also keeping the time, maybe I just lost this information. Maybe you had it in your presentation, but I didn't really get yet what this conference, or like there was a conference or a scientific conference and so forth. Like what role does this play in your study, or how is this related to this agency? And then finally, and then I leave you alone with that. It was this is for Dan, because I mean you already mentioned, like, with such a, I mean, it's a great data set. It's really impressive, and also because it's just done so many times, like with these cities, your survey. And you already told that, of course, they come from different geographic locations and so forth, and so you're aware of that, and with the data set. But then again, it struck me, and was so interested that migration again is like such an important topic now again for the cities, and not, for example, resilience anymore, like how it changed during the years. But there I was also asking myself, but then wouldn't it be so interesting to see if this is like for all cities, like in all these different geographic locations, this the case, or that would be very interesting to see like what are the difference also with resilience. And also, for example, I was just wondering, of course, you know this question, but it always comes, but the different sizes of cities, like did they, for example, have a influence? So, and now I leave you alone, sorry for all the questions, but it's just so interesting, all of your studies. Thanks. And maybe just start in the order I asked you.
Yeah, maybe Sebastian, do you want to go first and I complement if you want? Or if I'm getting you,
Yeah, go first, Niklas, please.
No, yeah, I think it's a good question, and maybe we need to elaborate a little bit more on the motivation. But I think the Power Cube, it already allows for assessing the level of participation and the power. But for us, it's really to understand like the participation, not only to have democratic inclusiveness and have everyone involved, but really the knowledge part of it. So in Bonn, this was very memorable in the case study. They invited all the citizens as experts of living in the city, and really had these mini assemblies in the city for getting their knowledge because they know how to best live in the city, and they have dreams. And it's not only about their dreams and this democratic aspects of, okay, we want a deliberation, but really retrieving their knowledge. And for us, this co-production style which happened in Bonn, this can be contrasted a lot with the one we did not really present right now, but in Ahmedabad, for example, this was mainly carried out by consultants, and they did some, you can say science style. So they did a vulnerability mapping and the CO2 emissions, but then they had this, it was a toolbox and tried to pick out their solutions, and it was just very top down, and this a way which was not participatory in the way, but as well, this is often how science, I think, is created, that we are living in this little bubble, and then we do our research, and then we present it to policymakers maybe, or in this ideal of the linear model, and then it is transferred to the policymakers, and they don't have any chance to interact. And we see this as well represented not through the or reproduced partially through the city network case in Ahmedabad. I don't know, Sebastian, if you want to comment quickly or if this is enough.
Yeah, with the scientific methods, there are so many choices already made, like the sectorization and the territorialization of the emissions, for example. So citizens don't actually have a say in what data actually represents their reality and in what way. And I think this is a very specific thing to knowledge, and also what knowledge counts, and in which context is has very much to do with knowledge and power dynamics. So we basically see a rise in literature of concepts like knowledge, co-production, and inter and transdisciplinary research. So we also wanted to take that up.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, maybe, I don't know if, this was more, again, like the comment and not the question. Do you still want to say something to that, Devin? I mean, you don't have to, as you want.
Oh, no, I don't think I have anything to add there. Thanks.
Thank you. Then maybe saying, let's go to your question.
Thank you so much. And great question. Thank you so much. I have put conceptually these two empirical sources that I have chosen as corresponding to perhaps two different elements. So military news portal SACS refers to this agency of national authorities, because in my examples, I focused on its political leadership, so Minister of Defense, but as you could see, it depicts also other high-profile officials and politicians. It's the Latvian president. It's high-level officials from Baltic states, from Poland, and from other allied countries. So, and then conference comes as a platform, annually organized platform for a more comprehensive meaning making. And why I chose also this conference is because, as you can see also from the analysis of the proceedings, it's a well-attended conference. So a lot of national, a lot of Latvian higher education and advanced research centers regularly participate there and contribute to the discussions, as well as many researchers from Europe, mostly, but then also perhaps some extended ties to other research centers around the world. So in that sense, and what I also gathered from the abstracts themselves of the presentations, it gives that essential fabric of a more contextualized meaning making. So what do these, newsworthy events actually mean to comprehensively understand the longitudinal pattern of comprehensive security of Latgale and Daugavpils as, the biggest urban settlement, but not in a 1 year duration, 2 year durations, but in a longitudinal. So there are many presentations regarding historical also aspects of how the city's positionality has evolved. And the conference itself does not include only presentations regarding the city itself or only Latgale as a very special region. No, it oftentimes looks at Latgale and Daugavpils as a city as very telling examples what happens actually in the regions across Latvia. So, about the development of non-capital city, non-Riga territories. Yeah. So in that sense, I'd say the University of Daugavpils conference embodies this environment. So where that agency is trying to engage with a broader environment. Of course, I mean, academics, it gathers mostly academics, but also some practitioners. Academics are not the only ones who shape the environment where Earth system governance occurs, right? And where it's accommodated. However, they are very important opinion leaders who, through their translation of certain understandings of what certain things mean in a broader context beyond sporadic occurrences, they can really influence opinion of many other notable sections of, let's say, the whole generalized environment. Yeah. So the public sphere, they have a notable role. So that's why I took this conference as an established reoccurring event that is well attended and that has a very broad scope of topics covered. So it can give a more comprehensive understanding. So not just military linked to ecological and some environmental aspects as well, since, what they are doing actually is infrastructure building there. A lot of security services are involved and construction companies. So there is some environmental link. However, the conference gives even a more comprehensive understanding. So what does that mean also culturally, societally? I hope I answered your question, but let me know if I should touch upon something else in more detail.
No, thank you. Perfect. Let's go to Dan with the question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I know we're almost at time. Yeah, I think they're great questions, Elisa. And I should have said, sorry, I was in my haste to keep to 10 minutes that, this work's been supported by Carnegie, California, and a few iterations of the survey of the Chicago Council. Global Affairs have been great to work with. Couple of points. So we've got to be, kind of careful with this sample, I think, because it isn't that many cities. So we've been dealing with sort of between, 50 and 60, which gives you a reasonable sample size, but we've been a little reluctant to do a lot of sort of regionally specific analysis, just because sometimes you're dealing with, not great numbers and it can skew it quite significantly. But I think migration is an interesting one. And I've done a different piece of work for a city network recently where we're sort of looking at the engagement of different regions in migration-focused networks. And I can certainly tell you that the Asia-Pacific cities I would be surprised if any of them, I haven't looked specifically in the data set of which cities selected which issues, but I think that's something I could do. It's quite a new data set, but I'd be surprised if any Asia-Pacific cities had migration as a focus, because they generally have not been as engaged in this ecosystem. And certainly there's been a lot of public narratives and focus and political pressure around migration in US cities. And it's always been a key focus of European cities, particularly Southern European cities. So I think that those would definitely be sort of drivers of those change. I wouldn't be surprised if the increase that we've seen over time is in a lot of US, North American cities, but certainly we can look at that. I think city size is an interesting point as well. One question we've had, we haven't usually analysed specifically on population, because it can get obviously a little tricky with administrative size and jurisdiction. We added a question this time around the staffing of international offices, so how many staff these international offices had, which is a really interesting proxy because it's not always the largest cities in terms of population that actually have. Some of them have comparatively quite small international offices. One city that we included in our sample reported having 100 people who work across international offices. There's some very large cities that have single digits in that space. So I think that that's interesting in terms of the capacity that they bring to actually engage internationally and not always cognate with their population. But interesting points. I appreciate we're at time, so I won't say much more.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, since we are already out of time, are there some burning questions left that should be asked? If not, I think we can already do a wrap up. Or Marielle, did you want to ask something? Sorry.
No, I did not. I just, since it's already 4 for me, I'd like to thank everyone. It's been a really interesting conversation. I really loved how all the panelists kind of took over and had so much interest in everyone's research. I think that was really nice. But I'll let you wrap up, Elisa. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I mean, also when I have the same point of view, can just say the same as Marielle. It was really great and so interesting. Again, like when I see your studies published, all of them, and I want to do also a bit of publicity for our event tomorrow for the annual urban working group meeting that we have. But now, Matteo and Marielle, you have to help me because the time, I just know it in German time. It's at 7 p.m. What is it in the other? Well, what maybe, yeah. You have to check it, exactly what time it is in your time.
Yeah, so for people based in Europe, 7 p.m. For people on the East Coast, it's going to be at 1 p.m. And people Pacific time, it's going to be at 10 a.m. I don't know about the Melbourne time, sorry. The Australia time. I'm not sure which time zone you're on then, sorry.
It's probably going to be not a great time, but that's totally fine.
It's going to be terrible. If it's good for me, it's terrible for you. That's all I know.
I think tomorrow it's for you, the terrible time then. But yeah, I mean, I really want to invite you too. We have some amazing speakers tomorrow as well. And maybe also to dive deeper into these topics, especially what you say and ask, like about the research methods, for example, that we do. That's a very important point, because tomorrow we also want to talk about like what unites us in our research on cities, because we are very interdisciplinary group coming from many disciplines. So it's going to be very interesting to see what unites us and where the synergies are, and also the challenges maybe. But yeah, with that, now we're already 3 minutes over time, but I think that's okay for a panel. Yeah, thank you so much, and hopefully see you soon. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye.